They say a man can outrun the world, but not the name someone gives him when he isn't looking. Elias Boone hadn't heard his own spoken in over a decade, not since the wind became his only neighbor and the creak of his porch the only voice that answered back. For 15 years, he lived where the dust settled thick on forgotten things, where fence posts leaned like tired men and the sun burned everything down to the truth. His ranch sat 20 miles from the nearest road, a place no one found unless they were lost or looking for something they couldn't name. And Elias, he made sure no one had reason to look. He rose before daylight, fed what little cattle he had left, fixed what the wind had broken overnight, and spoke to no one, not even himself. Silence wasn't loneliness anymore. It was a choice. A kind of penance he never explained. The locals, the few that remembered him, said he'd buried something out here years ago. Some said it was a woman. Others said it was his own past. Elias never corrected them. He just stayed. Then one morning, just as the first light cut through the cracks of his barn like thin blades of gold, something shifted. It wasn't loud. Not thunder, not hooves, not the kind of trouble that announces itself. Just a sound that didn't belong. A knock. Soft. Deliberate. The kind that waits to be answered. Elias froze with a bucket in his hand, listening the way a man listens when he's forgotten how to expect anything. No one knocked out here. Not ever. He set the bucket down slow, water sloshing over the edge, darkening the dirt beneath his boots. The air felt different. Heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. Then it came again. 3 knocks. Steady. Patient. Not demanding entry, just certain it would be opened. Elias stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under weight it hadn't carried for years. His hand hovered near the door, rough fingers hesitating inches from the handle. He didn't feel fear. Not exactly. Just something older. Something buried. When he finally pulled the door open, the light hit him first, then the figure standing in it. A young woman. No older than 20. Dark hair braided with care, eyes steady as the horizon. She stood there like she had every right to be, like she'd been expected. Behind her, at a distance, shapes moved, riders, maybe 20, sitting still in the morning haze, silent as carved stone. No weapons drawn, no threats made, just waiting. The girl didn't step forward, didn't bow, didn't flinch. She looked at Elias the way you look at something you've carried for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice calm, certain, carrying a weight that didn't belong to someone her age. "You took 15 years to open that door," she said. Elias didn't answer. His throat felt dry, as the land around him. The girl reached into her hand and lifted something small, something worn, something that caught the light just enough to make his breath catch before he understood why. "I didn't come here to find you," she said quietly. "I came to give you back a name." She paused, just long enough for the wind to move between them. Then, softer, like it had always belonged to him, she said, "Father." The words settled between them like dust that had been waiting years to fall, and Elias Boone did not reach for it, did not push it away, just stood there with his hand still on the door as if the wood behind him was the only thing keeping him upright, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in recognition he did not want to admit, because something in the way she said it did not sound like a mistake, and something deeper still told him it was not a lie, the wind slipping past her shoulders carrying the faint scent of sage and horse leather, the riders behind her unmoving, patient, as if time itself had paused for this moment to unfold, and Elias finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse, low and steady like a man testing words he had not trusted in years. "You have the wrong place," he said, not harsh, just certain, the kind of certainty built from years of silence. But the girl did not react, did not step back or look uncertain. She simply watched him, the way someone watches a storm. They already know will pass, and then she stepped forward just enough for the light to catch what she held between her fingers, a small strip of worn cloth, faded, frayed at the edges, nothing special to any other eye. But to Elias it was like seeing a ghost take shape in daylight, because he knew that cloth, knew the way it had torn under his hands, knew the night it had been part of, and his breath slowed, not quickened, as if his body understood before his mind did, and the girl spoke again, softer now, but no less certain. "You left before anyone could hear the truth," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only fact, only memory, and Elias felt something shift in his chest. That he had kept buried under years of dust and distance, something that did not belong to the man he had become out here. "I do not know you," he answered, but the words lacked weight, lacked the finality he intended, because the cloth was still there, catching the light, refusing to be ignored, and the girl tilted her head slightly, studying him not as a stranger, but as someone she had already measured long ago. "You pulled me from the river when the current was stronger than I was," she said. And the air seemed to tighten around the porch, the boards creaking softly beneath Elias as he shifted his weight without meaning to. "You tore this from my dress to keep me breathing when the cold took the rest," she continued, lifting the cloth just enough for him to see the stitching along one edge. Crude, hurried, done by hands that had not planned to stay, and for a moment the years folded in on themselves. The morning light replaced by memory he had spent 15 years trying to forget. And Elias looked past her, out toward the riders, counting them without thinking, 20, maybe more, all still, all watching without watching, and he understood then that this was not a visit, not a mistake, not something he could close the door on, but still he tried, still he held on to the only defense he had left. "If you came for something," he said slowly, "you should say it plain." And the girl finally took one more step forward, close enough now that the distance between them felt intentional, like a line neither of them would cross without meaning, and she lowered the cloth, her eyes steady, her voice quiet but unshakable. "I did not come to take anything," she said, and the wind moved again, softer this time, carrying her words across the space between them like something that had traveled a long way to be heard. "I came because you left before I could call you what you became the moment you chose not to walk away." She paused then, just long enough for Elias to feel the weight of it settle deeper than he wanted, deeper than he could deny. "And I have waited 15 years to say it where you could hear it," she finished, her gaze never leaving his, not as a child who needed saving, but as someone who remembers exactly who stood between her and the end of everything, and chose to stay just long enough to change it. The porch seemed smaller now, as if the years Elias Boone had spent stretching silence across this place were pulling back all at once, tightening around him with every word she spoke, and he found his eyes drawn again to the cloth in her hand, not because it was important by itself, but because of what it carried with it, something he had tried to leave behind in a night that never quite faded no matter how many mornings followed. And he stepped back once, just a half step, enough to put the door frame between them like a line he could still control, his fingers brushing the worn wood, grounding himself in something real, something present. "You should not be here," he said, quieter now, less certain than before, because the truth was beginning to press against the edges of his memory whether he allowed it or not, and the girl watched that hesitation, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a kind of patience that only comes from waiting a long time for something you already understand. And she lowered her hand, the cloth resting against her palm as if it no longer needed to prove anything. "You think leaving meant it ended," she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to reach him without force, and Elias let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting past her again, out toward the riders who still had not moved, their presence no longer threatening but unmistakably deliberate, like witnesses to something that had already been decided long before this morning. And he shook his head once, almost to himself. "I did what I had to," he replied, the words sounding practiced, worn smooth by repetition over years he had spent convincing himself of their truth. There was nothing else to stay for. And for the first time, something shifted in her expression, not disbelief, not anger, but something closer to understanding, as if she had expected that answer and had already prepared for it. "You stayed long enough," she said, and that sentence landed heavier than anything before it, because it did not argue, did not challenge. It simply existed as fact, and Elias felt his jaw tighten slightly, his eyes narrowing as the memory he had buried began to move again beneath the surface, not all at once, not clear, but in pieces, flashes of water, cold biting through bone, a small hand slipping from his grip before he forced it back, the sound of fabric tearing under strain, and then something else, something louder, voices carried by the wind, coming closer, and his own decision made in a single moment, to leave before those voices reached him, before explanations could be demanded, before anything could turn into something worse, and he had told himself it was the right choice, the only choice, that walking away had prevented something he could not control, and for 15 years that belief had held steady, until now, until she stood there looking at him not as a man who had abandoned something, but as one who had already given more than he realized. "You did not see what came after," she continued, her voice softer now, but steady as ever, and Elias did not answer, because he knew he had never allowed himself to wonder what came after, had never given that night a future beyond the moment he turned his back on it, and she took another small step forward, not enough to close the distance, but enough to shift it, enough to make it clear she was not leaving this unfinished. "They found me before the river could take anything else," she said, her eyes holding his with a calm certainty that did not need proof. "They saw the cloth in your hands and the way I was breathing, and they knew the difference between harm and help." And Elias felt something loosen inside his chest. Something he had held tight for too long without realizing the weight of it, and still he said nothing, because the part of him that had survived out here for 15 years did not trust easy answers, did not accept relief without question. But the girl did not press him, did not force the moment further than it would go. She simply stood there, letting the truth settle in its own time, letting him feel it without demanding he accept it. And behind her, the riders remained still, the morning stretching wider around them, as if the land itself was waiting to see what he would do with a past that had finally caught up to him, not with judgment, but with something far harder to face, something like grace. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, crowded with everything Elias Boone had refused to look at for 15 years, and he found himself stepping out onto the porch without realizing he had made the decision. The door left open behind him for the first time since he could remember, the hinges giving a low, tired sound as if even the house was unsure of what was happening. And the girl watched that small movement with quiet attention, not reacting, not pushing, simply allowing it, as if she understood that for a man like him, one step forward carried more weight than 100 words, and Elias stopped a few feet from her, close enough now to see the fine details he had missed before. The faint line along her wrist where skin had healed years ago, the steady rise and fall of her breath, the calm in her eyes that did not belong to someone seeking answers, but to someone who had already found them. And he looked at the cloth again, then back at her, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. "You said they knew," he murmured, not quite a question, not quite disbelief, and she nodded once, a small motion that carried certainty without force. "They saw what you did, even if you did not stay to see what it meant," she replied, and Elias let that settle. The idea that the truth had existed without him, had carried on without his presence, shaping something he had never allowed himself to imagine, and he glanced again toward the riders, noticing now that none of them had shifted position, none had spoken, and yet their stillness felt intentional, like respect rather than threat, and something in that realization unsettled him more than hostility ever could, because it asked something of him he had spent years avoiding, and he rubbed a hand slowly along his jaw, the rough scrape of stubble grounding him in the moment. "If they knew," he said carefully, "then why did no one come before now?" And for the first time, the girl's gaze softened, not in weakness, but in something closer to understanding the question behind the words. "Because I was not ready to stand here," she answered, and that answer held more weight than anything else she had said, because it shifted the center of the moment away from him, away from his choices, and placed it firmly in her hands, in her time, in her decision to come now and not before. And Elias studied her again, really studied her, seeing not just the child he half remembered, but the woman who had walked miles, maybe more, to stand on this porch and speak words he had never expected to hear, and the years between then and now suddenly felt real, tangible, something that had happened without him but not without consequence, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the tension beginning to loosen. "And now you are," he said, more statement than question, and she gave a slight nod, her eyes never leaving his. Now I am, she confirmed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the wind moving softly across the dry land, carrying with it the quiet presence of the riders and the weight of everything that had led to this morning, and Elias felt something unfamiliar settle into the space where doubt had lived for so long. Not certainty, not yet, but something that made room for it. Something that allowed the possibility that the story he had told himself for 15 years might not be the only one that existed, and he looked at her again, really. Looked, and this time when he spoke, the words came slower, more deliberate. "What is your name?" he asked, and it was a simple question, but it carried more meaning than anything he had said so far because it acknowledged her not as memory, not as mistake, but as someone standing in front of him in the present, and she held his gaze for a brief moment before answering, her voice steady, grounded. "Ayana," she said, and the name seemed to settle into the air between them, finding its place as naturally as if it had always been there, and Elias repeated it once under his breath, not loudly, not for her, but for himself, testing the sound, letting it exist in a space that had been silent for too long. And somewhere behind them, one of the horses shifted slightly, the soft sound breaking the stillness just enough to remind him that this moment did not belong only to the two of them, that there were others watching, waiting, not for conflict, but for something quieter, something harder to define, and Elias straightened just a little, his gaze moving from Ayana to the riders and back again, and for the first time since the knock at his door. He did not look like a man trying to close something out, but like one beginning to understand that some things were not meant to be kept outside at all. The name lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if the land itself was testing how it felt to hear something spoken here again, and Elias Boone did not rush past it, did not turn away like he might have before. He simply stood there with that quiet weight settling into him, and for the first time in years, the silence around his ranch did not feel like protection. It felt like something unfinished. And he shifted his stance slightly, boots pressing into the dry dirt as his gaze moved once more to the riders in the distance, then back to Ayana, measuring not threat but intention, and what he found there was not what he expected, because there was no demand in her eyes, no urgency, only a steady presence that did not need to prove itself, and that unsettled him more than anything else could have, because it left him with nothing to resist. "You came a long way," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less guarded, and Ayana gave a small nod. "Far enough," she answered, not offering distance, not naming miles, as if the journey mattered less than the reason behind it, and Elias let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering just a fraction. "And those men behind you," he added, tilting his head slightly toward the riders, "they came for the same reason," and Ayana turned her head just enough to glance back, not to check them, but to acknowledge them. "They came because I asked them to witness," she said, and that word landed differently than anything before it. Witness, not protect, not threaten, and Elias felt that difference settle in his chest, shifting something he had carried for too long without question. "Witness what?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would not be simple, and Ayana stepped just a little closer, the space between them narrowing not with pressure but with intention. "The truth you left behind," she said, her voice calm, unwavering, and Elias looked away for a moment, out across the open land, the same land he had watched day after day for 15 years, thinking he understood it, thinking he had made peace with everything it held, and now it felt different, like a place that had been holding something for him all along, waiting for him to turn back and see it, and he rubbed his hand slowly along the back of his neck, the gesture small but revealing. "I did not leave anything behind," he said, but the words lacked their old strength, because even as he spoke them, he could feel how they no longer fit the shape of what was happening here. And Ayana did not argue, did not push back against him. She simply reached forward and placed the worn strip of cloth into his hand, closing his fingers around it with a gentle firmness that carried no force, only certainty, and Elias felt the texture of it against his skin, rough, familiar, and for a moment, the years between then and now seemed to disappear completely, replaced by the cold memory of water and urgency and a choice made without thinking. And he looked down at it, then back up at her, his voice lower, almost uncertain. "Now, I stayed just long enough," he said quietly, repeating her earlier words as if trying to understand them from the inside, and Ayana nodded once. "And that was enough," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt, just a simple truth that did not need to be defended, and Elias swallowed slowly, his grip tightening slightly around the cloth, not out of fear, but because something in him was beginning to recognize what he had spent years refusing to see, that leaving had not erased what happened, that silence had not undone it, and that whatever he had thought he abandoned that night had not been lost at all. And he lifted his gaze again to meet hers. Really meet it this time, without turning away, without retreating into the quiet he had built around himself, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the wind moving softly across the land, carrying with it the presence of the riders and the weight of everything that had led to this morning, and Elias Boone stood there with something in his hand that belonged to his past, and something in front of him that belonged to his future. And for the first time in 15 years, he did not look like a man trying to hold on to what he had left behind, but like one beginning to understand that some things were never meant to be left at all. The cloth sat heavier in Elias Boone's hand than something that small had any right to be, and he turned it once between his fingers as if the years might fall out of its seams if he looked at it long enough, the rough stitching catching against his callous skin, each thread a reminder of a night he had told himself was finished, and yet here it was, returned to him not as proof of what he had done wrong, but as something else entirely, something he had never allowed himself to consider, and he let his hand fall slowly to his side, still holding it, not hiding it anymore, not pretending it did not belong to him, and when he looked up again, Ayana had not moved, her posture steady, her eyes calm, waiting not for an answer, but for him to reach one on his own, and that patience pressed against him in a way no demand ever could, because it gave him no place to hide, no argument to push against, only space to face what he had avoided, and he shifted his weight slightly, boots scraping softly against the dirt, his gaze drifting once more toward the riders, and this time he saw something different in them, not distance, not silence, but a quiet presence that felt deliberate, as if they were not there for her protection, but for something that belonged to all of them, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as the tension that had held him for so long began to loosen its grip, not all at once, but enough to let something else in. "You said they came to witness," he said, his voice quieter now, steadier, no longer pushing the moment away, and Ayana nodded once, her gaze never leaving his. "They came to see what a man does when he has given back what he thought he lost," she replied, and the words settled into him deeper than he expected, because they did not accuse, did not judge, they simply named something he had not realized was happening, and Elias looked down at the cloth again, then back at her, his brow tightening slightly. "I did not lose anything," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt different, less like truth and more like something he had been holding onto out of habit, and Ayana stepped forward just enough to close the distance between them by another inch, not invading, not forcing, simply narrowing the space until it could no longer be ignored. "You lost the chance to see what your choice became," she said gently, and that sentence landed with a quiet weight that shifted everything, because it did not challenge what he had done. It revealed what he had missed, and Elias felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with understanding, and he lifted his gaze again, meeting hers fully now, no longer glancing away, no longer retreating. "And what did it become?" he asked, not defensive, not doubtful, but genuinely wanting to know, and for the first time since she arrived. Ayana's expression changed just slightly, not into a smile, not into anything easy, but into something deeper, something that carried both strength and memory. "It became a life that was not taken," she said, her voice steady, grounded, and Elias felt that answer settle into him in a way nothing else had. Because it was simple, direct, and impossible to argue with, and he nodded once without realizing it, a small motion that acknowledged more than words could, and the wind moved again, brushing past them both, carrying the faint sound of leather and quiet breath from the horses behind her, and Elias stood there with the cloth still in his hand, the past no longer something distant and buried, but something present and undeniable. And he took a slow step forward, not away, not back, but toward her, closing the distance just enough to show that something had shifted, something had opened, and he spoke again, his voice low but clear. "You did not come all this way just to say that." And Ayana held his gaze, her eyes steady as the horizon. "No," she said softly. "I came because there is something you have not seen yet." And she turned her head slightly, just enough to gesture toward the riders behind her. And for the first time since they arrived, Elias Boone felt the full weight of their presence, not as something distant, but as something waiting, something that had not yet been revealed. And he followed her gaze, the morning stretching wide around them, the land holding its breath once more, as if whatever came next would not be spoken loudly, but would change everything all the same. The moment stretched thin as Elias Boone followed her gaze, his eyes settling on the riders who had remained nothing more than shadows at the edge of his understanding until now, and something in the way Ayana stood beside him made it clear that whatever he had not seen was not hidden by distance, but by choice, and he felt that truth settle into him as steadily as the morning light spreading across the dry land. And then it happened. Not all at once, not in a way meant to startle, but in a slow, deliberate shift that carried more weight than any sudden movement ever could. One of the riders stepped forward, then another, and another, their horses moving with quiet precision until they formed a loose line several yards from the porch, close enough to be seen clearly now, close enough that Elias could make out the details he had ignored before, the worn leather, the careful posture, the stillness that was not emptiness but restraint, and he felt his breath deepen, not from fear, but from the recognition that this was the moment Ayana had been leading him toward, and he did not move, did not step back. He simply watched, the cloth still in his hand, grounding him to something real as the past and present began to meet in front of him. And then, without a word, the first rider dismounted, his boots touching the ground with a soft, steady sound, and he did not approach Elias directly, did not challenge him or speak. He simply turned slightly toward Ayana, his head lowering just enough to show respect, and Elias noticed it immediately, the direction of that gesture, not toward him, but toward her, and it told him something he had not yet fully understood, that this moment was not about authority, not about power, but about something else entirely. And one by one, the others followed, each dismounting in the same quiet way, each movement measured, intentional, until the line of riders became a line of men standing in the dust, their presence no longer distant, no longer abstract, but fully here, fully part of whatever was unfolding. And Elias felt a strange steadiness settle into his chest, because there was no hostility in any of it, no demand, only a shared purpose that he was only beginning to see. And he glanced briefly at Ayana, his voice low, almost careful. "You said they came to witness," and she nodded, her eyes still forward, still calm. "They came to stand where truth is spoken without fear," she replied, and that answer carried a quiet gravity that seemed to hold everything in place, the men, the land, even the wind that had stilled just enough to let the moment breathe. And Elias looked back at them, really looked this time, and what he saw was not judgment, not expectation, but recognition, as if they already knew something about him that he had only just begun to understand himself, and he felt the weight of that without it pressing him down, without it demanding anything from him except honesty. And he took a slow step forward off the porch, the wood creaking softly behind him as he moved into the open space between his past and whatever came next, and the dirt shifted under his boots, grounding him in a way the house no longer could. And he stopped a few feet from Ayana, standing not above her, not apart from her, but beside her, and for a moment, the two of them faced the riders together. And Elias Boone, who had spent 15 years turning away from anything that reached for him, did not turn away this time, did not retreat into silence or distance. He simply stood there, holding the cloth that tied him to a night he had misunderstood, and looking at the people who had come not to take anything from him, but to show him what had been waiting all along. And in that stillness, something shifted again, something quiet but undeniable, because for the first time since the knock at his door, Elias was no longer standing as a man defending his past, but as one ready to hear it told the way it had truly happened. No one spoke, and yet something had already been said, something that did not need words to carry its weight, and Elias Boone felt it in the way the men stood before him, not rigid, not demanding, but present, as if each of them understood that what was happening here was not something to interrupt, not something to rush, and he let his gaze move across them slowly, taking in the details he had missed before, the age in some faces, the youth in others, the quiet strength that came not from proving anything, but from knowing exactly where they stood, and he realized then that they were not here to judge him, not here to measure him against anything. They were here because this moment belonged to more than just him and Ayanna. It belonged to a truth that had waited long enough to be seen, and he felt his grip on the cloth loosen slightly, not because it meant less, but because it no longer needed to be held so tightly. And he looked down at it once more. Then slowly, deliberately, he extended his hand toward Ayanna, offering it back, not as rejection, not as denial, but as something closer to acknowledgement, and she did not take it immediately. She simply looked at his hand, then at his face, reading what he was saying without words, and after a brief moment, she shook her head gently. "It was never mine to keep," she said softly, and that answer settled into him with a quiet finality, because it shifted the meaning of everything again. Not a token returned, not a debt repaid, but something that belonged to the moment itself, something that could not be passed back and forth like a simple object, and Elias let his hand lower again, the cloth still in his possession, but no longer as a burden, no longer as something tied to misunderstanding, and he drew a slow breath, the air filling his chest in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost like relief, though he would not have called it that yet. And then Ayanna stepped forward one final time, closing the distance between them until there was no space left to misread, no distance left to hide behind, and she turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the men behind her voice carrying just enough to reach them without rising. "He sees it now," she said, and the words moved through the line of men like a quiet current, not loud, not dramatic, but understood, and in response, something shifted, subtle but undeniable. One of the older men stepped forward, his movements measured, his presence calm, and he stopped several feet from Elias, his gaze steady but not hard, and for a moment, the two men looked at each other, not as strangers, not as opposites, but as individuals standing on the same ground for the same reason, and the older man gave a small nod. Nothing more, nothing less, and in that gesture there was no demand, no expectation, only recognition, and Elias felt that nod settle into him deeper than anything that had come before, because it asked nothing of him, it simply acknowledged what already was, and he found himself returning the gesture without thinking, a small inclination of his head, simple, honest, and when he straightened again, something inside him had shifted completely, not loudly, not in a way that could be pointed to, but in the way he stood, the way his shoulders settled, the way his eyes no longer searched for a way out of the moment, and Ayanna watched that change with quiet certainty, as if this was the part she had always known would come, not because she forced it, but because it had been there all along, waiting for him to allow it, and she spoke once more, her voice softer now, carrying no weight of proof, only the truth itself. "You did not leave me behind," she said, and Elias did not answer right away, because this time he did not need to defend himself, did not need to correct her. He simply let the words settle, let them find their place where doubt had lived for so long, and after a moment, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, not to her, not to the men, but to something within himself, something that had finally stopped resisting what had always been true, and in that quiet, without any command, without any signal, the men behind her lowered themselves to one knee, one by one, not in submission, not in display, but in respect, and the movement was so calm, so deliberate, that it felt less like an action and more like a statement, something that did not need explanation, and Elias Boone stood there, still, grounded, the cloth in his hand and the truth in front of him, and for the first time in 15 years, he did not look like a man alone. The dust settled slowly around them, not stirred by movement anymore, but by something quieter, something that lingered after a moment had already passed, and Elias Boone stood in the middle of it with a stillness that no longer felt like isolation, but like presence, like a man who had finally stopped walking away from his own life, and he looked at the line of men kneeling before him, not as a spectacle, not as something meant to impress or overwhelm, but as a gesture that carried no weight of expectation, only acknowledgement, and it was that absence of demand that reached him the deepest, because for 15 years he had believed that if the past ever found him again, it would come with judgment, with consequences he would have to answer for, and instead it had come with silence, with patience, with something that asked nothing but honesty, and he lowered his gaze for a moment, not in submission, but in reflection, feeling the shape of that truth settle into him where doubt had once lived, and when he lifted his head again, his eyes found Ayanna, who had not knelt, who stood exactly where she had from the beginning, steady, grounded, as if this entire moment had been built around her certainty, and he saw her differently now, not as a memory returned, not as a question answered, but as something that had carried his choice forward long after he had left it behind, and he took a slow step toward her, closing the final distance that had remained between them, the cloth still in his hand, no longer a symbol of confusion, but something simpler, something clearer, and he looked at it one last time before gently folding it once, carefully, deliberately, not to hide it, but to keep it, and then he reached out, not with words, not with explanation, but with a quiet motion that carried more meaning than anything he could have said, and he placed his hand lightly against her shoulder, the gesture steady, certain, and Ayanna did not move away, did not react with surprise. She simply accepted it, as if it had always been meant to happen, as if the 15 years between then and now had been nothing more than distance waiting to be crossed, and the wind moved softly through the open land, carrying the scent of dust and leather and something else, something like change, something like a door opening after being closed too long, and behind them, the men remained where they were, not because they were waiting for more, but because they understood that nothing more was needed, and Elias let his hand rest there for just a moment longer before drawing it back, his eyes still on hers, and he spoke, his voice low, steady, not loud enough to carry far, but clear enough to be heard where it mattered. "You should not have had to wait that long," he said, and there was no apology in the words, no regret spoken aloud, only a simple recognition of time and what it had taken, and Ayanna's expression softened just slightly, not into a smile, but into something warmer, something that carried both strength and understanding. "Some things take time to be seen," she replied, and that answer settled into him with a quiet finality, because it did not blame, did not excuse, it simply acknowledged what was, and Elias nodded once, slowly, as if accepting not just her words, but everything they carried with them, and he turned then, just enough to glance back at the open door of his house, the dark interior no longer feeling like a refuge, but like a place that had been waiting, and he looked at Ayanna again, then beyond her to the men, and for a moment, nothing was said, nothing was asked, but something was understood, and he stepped aside, just a half step, just enough to clear the path from the porch too. The open door, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but one that carried more weight than any grand gesture ever could, and Ayanna saw it, and the men saw it, and no one rushed, no one spoke, because out here, in a place where silence had once meant distance, it now meant something else entirely, something fuller, something earned, and Elias Boone stood there with the door open behind him, and the past no longer at his back, but beside him. And for the first time in 15 years, he did not wait for it to leave.